150,000 tons. That is the amount of American beef rejected by Canada in a single, devastating sweep. It wasn't a logistical error. It wasn't a safety check. It was a decision made quietly inside Ontario's agricultural ministry that sent a shockwave across the entire global food system. For decades, the world held one belief with absolute certainty. The United States was the heavyweight champion of beef exports. If you ordered a premium steak in Tokyo, Dubai, or Berlin, chances were high it came from an American ranch. The US wasn't just a supplier, it was the supplier. Reliable, dominant, and untouchable. But then, something snapped. When Ontario rejected that massive shipment, it wasn't just a trade dispute. It was a direct retaliation wrapped in cold, hard economics. Almost instantly, the illusion of American invincibility shattered. Japan paused shipments. Germany reconsidered contracts. The UAE began looking elsewhere. A global market that once bent toward the US suddenly shifted its gaze north. Why did the world's agricultural superpower suddenly stumble, and how did Canada rise to take its place at the exact same moment? The answer isn't just about cattle. It's about the sudden collapse of trust. Once Ontario made its move, the reaction wasn't just local, it was global. The first domino to fall was Japan, arguably the most important buyer of premium beef on the planet. For years, Japanese demand was the bedrock of American export profits. But almost immediately after Canada's rejection made headlines, Japanese buyers quietly pulled back, reducing future orders. They didn't announce a total ban, but the silence was deafening. The message was clear. If the US supply chain was vulnerable enough for Canada to reject, it was too risky for Japan to rely on. Germany followed next. Known for long-term planning and rigid adherence to contracts, German importers began reassessing agreements that had been renewed automatically for decades. Then came the UAE, a market that demands consistent luxury imports, which started actively exploring new partners. The psychological shift was instantaneous. International buyers weren't just looking for a temporary fix during a hiccup, they were fundamentally hedging their bets against a partner they no longer trusted. Meanwhile, inside the United States, the impact was physical, visible, and painful. Export terminals, usually humming with efficiency, began to choke. Containers sat idle on docks, collecting dust instead of revenue. Refrigerated storage facilities hit capacity, and shipments backed up for miles. Ranchers, already squeezed by brutal inflation, watched helplessly as these logistical bottlenecks destroyed their margins. Feed, fuel, and labor costs were rising, yet they couldn't move their product. Rumors swirled that this shift wasn't as sudden as it appeared, that foreign buyers had been uneasy about US trade volatility for years. Canada simply gave them the excuse they needed to act. The Ontario rejection wasn't just a lost shipment, it was the catalyst. It was the match that lit a pile of dry tinder accumulating for years. The global market, which once viewed American beef as the gold standard, now viewed it as a liability. As American ranchers scrambled to save their businesses, they realized the terrifying truth. The world had stopped waiting for them. To understand why the American beef industry collapsed under pressure, we have to stop looking at Canada and start looking deep inside the United States itself. The narrative that Canada simply stole the market is false. The reality is far more concerning. The American system was already crumbling from within long before Ontario signed that rejection order. The first undeniable sign of structural failure came from the industry's own titan, Tyson Foods. When Tyson announced it would shut down its major facility in Lexington, Nebraska, and simultaneously downgrade its massive plant in Amarillo, Texas to a single shift, it wasn't a corporate restructuring. It was a 5-alarm fire bell ringing across the Midwest. These facilities are the arteries of the American food supply. For an industry that prides itself on non-stop, high-volume efficiency, scaling back operations of that magnitude was an admission that the machine was broken. The industry was, in many ways, a hollow giant. The pandemic had left brutal, unhealed scars on the agricultural infrastructure. Ranchers were fighting a war on multiple fronts. Feed costs had skyrocketed to historic highs, making it prohibitively expensive to maintain large herds. Labor shortages meant that even if cattle were ready for processing, the plants lacked the hands to butcher them. Transportation delays turned fresh logistics into a nightmare of spoilage and missed deadlines. By the time the crisis hit, many farms were already stretched to the absolute limit. They weren't expanding, they were liquidating. Ranchers were trimming herds, delaying slaughter dates, and juggling debts just to keep the lights on. The industry was running on fumes, lacking the resilience to absorb any new shocks. But the physical constraints were only half the story. The other half was political. For nearly a half-century, U.S. beef was a brand that meant consistency. However, in recent years, foreign buyers watched in dismay as the U.S. agricultural sector swung wildly between administrations. Trade policy became a weapon rather than a service. Washington's aggressive tariff battles and unpredictable export rules turned long-standing partners into collateral damage. The message sent to the world was one of volatility. Buyers in Japan, Europe, and the Middle East saw a supplier that was willing to use food trade as political leverage. They saw instability in pricing and uncertainty in delivery. The trust that had been built over decades was slowly chipped away, replaced by frustration. So, when Ontario rejected 150,000 tons of beef, they weren't attacking a fortress. They were pushing against a wall that was already cracking. The rejection exposed the uncomfortable truth that the U.S. beef industry, weakened by internal economic exhaustion and external political chaos, was no longer the untouchable leader it claimed to be. Canada didn't have to destroy the U.S. market. The U.S. had already done most of the work itself. While the United States scrambled to put out fires and maintained old relationships, Canada stepped forward with a calm confidence that the world noticed immediately. The contrast was stark. While American ranchers worried about shrinking contracts and political volatility, Canadian producers saw an unprecedented opening. But they didn't seize it with aggression, they seized it with stability. Canada has always been a significant beef exporter, but it never tried to be the dominant one. It couldn't compete with the sheer volume of American production. So instead of trying to be the biggest, Canada spent years quietly positioning itself as the safest. When the chaos unfolded south of the border, international buyers began emailing Canadian suppliers not just for emergency stock, but for long-term deals, volume commitments, and new pricing structures.
For the first time in decades, international markets viewed Canada as a safer bet. The maple leaf label transitioned from being a solid alternative to a symbol of premium stability. Canada's reputation for rigorous quality control and agricultural transparency became its greatest asset. Unlike the U.S., Canada wasn't caught in the crossfire of tariff battles or the logistical nightmare of supply chain mismanagement. Diplomacy played a massive, often overlooked role in this shift. Canadian officials had spent years building trust through quiet, consistent engagement with key markets in Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. Countries like Japan and South Korea, cultures that value reliable long-term relationships over short-term price cuts, found Canada's model refreshing. Buyers in the UAE admired Canada's clean production standards. Even Germany, a market notorious for its strict import regulations, saw Canada as a dependable partner that wouldn't default on contracts due to domestic political drama. What looked like a sudden boom to the outside world was actually the payoff of a much larger calculated strategy. Canada's rise in the beef market wasn't random, and it certainly wasn't lucky. It was the result of a decade of investment in agricultural modernization, safety audits, and export certification programs designed to boost global credibility. They positioned themselves as a neutral, stable supplier in an increasingly polarized world. When the U.S. began facing agricultural controversies, Canada kept its system clean. When Washington started tariff wars, Ottawa responded with handshakes. When American ranchers struggled with wild cost fluctuations, Canada maintained predictable pricing models. Experts now suggest that Canada had been preparing for an opportunity like this for a long time, not by actively undermining the U.S., but by ensuring they were perfectly positioned to catch the market the moment the U.S. stumbled. Once Ontario rejected those American shipments, global buyers didn't waste time. They didn't view Canada as a backup plan anymore, they viewed it as an upgrade. They moved toward the country they trusted most, rewarding the strategy of patience over the strategy of dominance. The most alarming realization for American analysts is that this shift is likely not reversible. Many assumed that once the political dust settled, the global market would naturally drift back to the United States due to its sheer size and historical dominance. But that assumption ignores the fundamental nature of modern supply chains. The impact of this shift didn't stay confined to export terminals. It reshaped the very infrastructure of global food contracts. Restaurants adjusted menus. Food processors rewrote sourcing agreements. Retail buyers, burned by American delays and price spikes, sought to future-proof their businesses. When these major international buyers turned to Canada, they didn't just buy meat, they bought stability. They signed multi-year deals, locking in price and volume for the foreseeable future. In the complex world of logistics, these contracts are incredibly sticky. Once a supply chain is rerouted and proven reliable, corporate buyers rarely switch back to a volatile partner just because the immediate crisis is past. Canada is selling peace of mind. The U.S. is currently selling drama. That distinction has reshaped the market. Economists have warned Washington that this is not a temporary hiccup. In food markets, trust is the ultimate currency. If a supplier becomes unpredictable, buyers don't just wait, they move on. American ranchers are now finding themselves squeezed between rising costs and permanently shrinking market access. They are forced to watch as contracts that once defaulted to the U.S. now head north. The United States is facing a harsh economic reality. Trust, once lost, takes years to rebuild. Canada isn't just renting this market share, they are occupying it. For the U.S., the fear is no longer about a bad quarter. The fear is that we are witnessing the beginning of a new era where the United States is no longer the default leader of the agricultural world, but merely a competitor struggling to catch up. The North American beef market didn't collapse overnight, and Canada didn't rise by accident. What began as a quiet rejection in Ontario revealed something far bigger than a simple trade dispute. It showed the world who was prepared, who was consistent, and who had been quietly building trust while everyone else assumed the old system would last forever. Canada didn't have to outmuscle America. It only had to be reliable when the U.S. wasn't. That reliability, steady pricing, clean audits, and diplomatic calm became more valuable than sheer size. In global food markets, reliability is power. This serves as a stark reminder to any industry leader. Leadership doesn't always belong to the biggest player. Sometimes it belongs to the one that stays steady when everything else starts shaking. The balance has shifted, and as the U.S. fights to rebuild confidence, the world has already noticed that the map has changed forever.